Hello, welcome to Transforming Your Board Meeting. This is a two-part webinar series, and today is part one. We're going to be discussing how the current board meeting is broken. If you're either sitting on a board or you're a CEO that has a board, you know this is true. A lot of these board meetings are frankly boring. And by the way, I'm Andrea Paulton. I am the Vice President of Marketing at Techstars. So a lot of you I've already talked to on LinkedIn, but make sure you hook up with me there as well. So before we're going to get started, we want to wait a little bit until people gather. I want to know, where are you calling in from? Go join the chats. We have multiple tools going. We have a Bizzabo tool going, and there's a section called Join the Conversation. And then there's also on LinkedIn, we have a live, so you can do chats in there. So let us know where you're from, get to know each other. You can even drop in your LinkedIn handle so we can all befriend each other. But I want to make sure you guys are active, you guys are here, and we're gonna have a lively conversation. We're gonna start in a couple of minutes, and at the end, we are going to take questions from you. So if you have any questions, just pop them in, and we will spend about 10 to 15 minutes on the questions. Okay. Let's get started with the board meeting is broken. So we have an incredible panel of speakers lined up for you. First up, we got the brilliant Edward Norton. You know him as one of the most celebrated actors of our time. And beyond the screen, he's also a prolific producer, writer, and director. But he's not here for that today. Today, he's here because he's a visionary founder behind CrowdRise, EDO, Stacks Engineering, and Zeck. So joining him is going to be Robert Wolfe. He's the CEO and co-founder of Zeck, completely transforming how boards operate. Definitely check out their tool, hear from them today. Zeck is amazing. And on a side note, if you ever meet Robert Wolfe in person, apparently he's a trivia champ. He's going to ask you you can ask him a million questions and he can answer them for you. So make sure you do that if you ever get to meet him. And lastly, but not least, we got David Cohen. He's the powerhouse behind Techstars. He's the founder and CEO. And he's also my boss. So for my sake, let's make this an amazing session, everyone. I'm counting on you. So David, go ahead. You take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. Great to be with all of you today. And I guess I'll get it out of the way. Edward, I'm sure you hear this all the time. I have to start by saying that I am a huge fan of Zeck. And you get that a lot.
Yeah,
So everyone on the panel, Robert's been really amazing to work with, and Zeck has already completely changed how we operate our own board and our productivity at Techstars. And of course, we're big fans of all your work, Edward, at CrowdRise and EDO and Stacks. And okay, yeah, also on the big screen. I mean, amazingly huge fans. We'll admit
thank you.
it. Thanks for being with us. Let's start with something pretty simple for people. There are probably a lot of founders and startups listening in. What is a board? Why does it exist in the first place? And what are the misperceptions that founders or CEOs, especially with startups, might have around boards?
Yeah, that's I think that of there's a lot underneath what you just said, and I'm gonna, not to be too academic or geeky, but I'm gonna back up maybe even deeper than you intended, and because I think that boards are a reflection of kind of a legacy organizational theory that we have. And I think that actually goes back to really deep roots in American life. And this will be the academic part, but I think it's interesting. If you read the famous book Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, who's this young French aristocrat who came to America in the early days to assess, like, what is this new society? What is this new republic of self-governance and all these things, right? If you look at what he observes, he basically concludes that this is the best self-organizing society in the history of the world. He basically comments that democracy in America looks like people getting together to solve problems without needing government, and that the reason that this kind of loose idea of federalism worked was the intense net matrix of localism that was underneath it all, right? He talked about like the Americans' capacity to self-govern. And I think it is this thing that's very deeply embedded in the DNA of the United States, which is and it metastasizes up into the way we've approached companies, right? Companies as an organization, companies as an expression of localism or problem solving or self-organization. And the board is so wild when you think about it, because it's kind of this artifact. It's this artifact of some very old ideas about governance that come from the early days of the corporation and stuff like that. But today, I think that it's worth really pulling down kind of all the old received ideas of why do we have this structural feature of an enterprise company called a board? What is it really there to do? What do we want it to do? What can it do at its best? But what is it doing? What are the legacy features of it that are actually creating drag on an organization as opposed to, propulsion? And where did that come from? And Zeck, to be totally honest, I mean, you hit on it, but I obviously have a pretty interesting day job. I wasn't wildly compelled to like start a SaaS company around corporate board practices just because I wanted to start a business. I actually, for me, it grew up and out of 30 years of serving on first nonprofit arts organizations boards, and then environmental nonprofits, and then corporations, and then starting my own companies and experiencing these dynamics, and really coming to feel that this isn't a small esoteric feature of our organizational life. We have 2 million nonprofits in the United States and many, many millions more companies. When you think about the fact that on the average, boards range from 5 to 10 people, sometimes more, but let's call it averaging 10. I think conservatively, there's 50 million people in the United States who are in some way or another are enmeshed in the dynamics between management of organizations and the board. And how that dynamic is going actually affects the qualitative experience of people's working life. So if you have negative dynamics around the board in an organization, you're talking about something like a sixth of the American populace is experiencing those dynamics in some way, and maybe it's negatively affecting their day and even their emotional relationship to their work. So we actually don't think this is like a small esoteric thing. We think this is actually a pretty big something that if you can reform it and make it better, you can actually really change the EQ in people's working lives in meaningful ways. And I think the problem, a lot of the problems rise up from something that's become a default assumption about boards, which is that investors, by virtue of having put money into a company, are there to manage risk, right? That they are there to fundamentally monitor and protect their investment. And this happens in the nonprofit side too, because you have donors, institutional donors, who are basically your investors, and they're there to manage and monitor and protect their investments. But a unidirectional, an organization that has this cohort on it that has a unidirectional like monitoring and is not positive. Like the management is the leadership of the company, and management teams fundamentally, I think, start to resent the hall monitor version of the relationship, and all kinds of negative things flow out of that. And I think that when we talk about like what are the ways you can improve the qualitative relationships, we think there's sort of two things you need to hack at. You need to look at the way that quantitative inefficiency, the wasting of time, affects both sides of the table negatively, but it incubates negative dynamics because it the board meeting tends to be rearward looking. When you have a monitoring relationship, it tends to be rearward looking instead of forward looking. And we kind of rooted at Zeck. Zeck isn't really, I mean, we have cool software features stuff, but we were not trying to like create the 2.0 version of Diligent, which is a piece of shit. You know what I mean? We were trying to really fundamentally, philosophically reform the qualitative experience that people are getting in having a board, and the quantitative affects that, but it's not actually what you're really trying to fix. You're really trying to change the relationship so that it's a relationship that expresses mutual obligation to the organization and that is fundamentally more forward looking than rearward looking. And I think that's a lot of times you hear people say my board sucks. My board dynamics suck, but they can't really say why. They name things, but they name the wrong things. And I think one of the things that's valuable about doing this, David, is like, it's almost important to correctly categorize the nature of what's actually going on in boards, and I think that's what makes this an interesting project, which is it's actually a fairly ubiquitous experience, but sometimes people are not even correctly identifying what the underlying root problems are.
Yeah, and I think it's for me, just in my world of most of the companies I work with or sit on boards of, they're pretty small. But when the board is actually strategic, when it actually is forward looking, the impact is so obvious. And it's interesting to map that to what you said about 50 million people, right, spending their time doing this, and many of them much larger or potentially much more impactful organizations. Super interesting. So yeah, I think I once heard you say somewhere else, I can't remember, like, this is your life, it's ending 1 minute at a time. Was that inspired by a real life board experience that you had by any chance? Why is it that many of the board meetings that we have today end up being not that valuable or wasting time? Is it because it's towards looking?
Well, I really do think we think that the qualitative experience and the sense of inspiration and motivation and even obligation and commitment that an organization wants to engender in a board gets really seriously negatively impacted by the quantitative waste of time. And let's break that down. Think about the fact that, like, I mean, sometimes we say the number of people who set as their aspirational career goal building a board deck is 0. Like, nobody graduated college with the aspiration to be the best builder of a deck, right? So any amount of time that companies spend doing that is a waste of time, and they perceive it as a waste of time, and nobody wants to do it. It's drudge work, right? The fact that dynamic companies, the leaders in dynamic companies, essentially go pencils down 4 to 8 times a year to prepare for that process is fundamentally a black hole of inefficiency. And one of the things that rises out of it is resentment in the management team, that they're preparing for an exam that they have to take with their board multiple times a year, right? So one of the things, first principles that we tried to deal with is one of the reasons that happens is everybody has to rewrite the blank page every time. And one of the things that's so cool about Zeck AI and the other feature sets of Zeck is that it's much easier to be an editor than a writer. And we can say confidently at this point that the cohort of companies that use our platform are saving about 80% of their redundant preparatory time. Not 20% savings of time, 80% reduction in the preparatory time that they have to spend getting ready for board meetings. And that's meaningful. That's really significant. But then on the flip side of the table, let's go to the other side, because I've definitely experienced this. I've experienced it both ways. I really hate it when the team of any of my own companies says we've got to get ready for the board meeting. You just sit there going, oh my God, like we're literally right in the middle of our flow, going pencils down to get ready for something. But on the board side, now, I'm on about 7 boards, right? And if you think about it, when you receive a 90-page to 150-page PDF 48 hours before the board meeting, and it's in a PDF slide deck. So you're sitting on your phone at the airport terminal trying to pinch zoom in on this slide deck, like basically a technology from the mid 90s. And you have a question, and then you read the whole thing, you do your work and you read the whole thing, and you show up at the meeting, and this dynamic management team that you've agreed to serve on their board or you invested in or whatever, then spends the next 4 hours reading back to you verbatim the slide deck that they already sent you. Of course, resentment builds and boredom builds, and your board is on their phone. They're on Zoom, but they're looking down below the screen because they're on their phone. Because this is just, they should resent it. That's a lame way to get a bunch of information. And if you think about it, then you also spend an hour out of 4 meeting doing BS governance. You vote on minutes, you vote on employee stock option agreements, you do all kinds of stuff that you could have done. You have someone on the board who's lazy and didn't do the work, and so they're asking clarifying questions, and by the time you're done, these board members, who are busy people too, probably burned 2 hours of their time on stuff that could have been addressed prior to the meeting if it wasn't something sent to them in a PDF. So in a cloud-based world, like, why are we still getting board materials? Why are we doing information sharing fixed slide PDFs? You would never get a FedEx packet full of signature tabs on legal documents that you had to send back today. You wouldn't manage your cap table in an Excel spreadsheet with a law firm. Why are we still having board dynamics managed on a non-cloud-based system where you not only can't iterate, like if I'm a board member and I'm reading the deck and I have a clarification I want to ask about the financials, why can't I write that in private into the platform itself at the moment that I'm reading it and have the management answer that question back before we show up at the meeting? Or if I need to approve employee stock options, why can't I read them, read the CEO's statement about them, and vote to approve them so that all of this is done before the meeting? Clearly, that should be the baseline expectation for the robustness of the tool set you're using. And you can say, well, that's functional. Yes, it's functional, it's time saving, but what does it do? It means that when you get into the meeting, you can talk about what's got to happen going forward. You can strip away the rearward looking review of information that all the professionals around the table should have been able to do prior to the meeting. And you can be saying to the board, look, this is what keeps me up at night. What's the problem? What are the problems? You can be saying to your board, hey, I want to circle the table before the end of the meeting and have every single person on the board tell me what is the proactive action they are going to take before the next meeting. You know what I mean? You want to create a culture of forward-looking engagement and obligation, but it's really hard to do that when you waste everybody's time with hours of rearward-looking review of information. And that's just not the best use of the board's time, but it's also not the best way to cultivate a qualitative improvement in what they're contributing to you. So that's why we sort of think that the quantitative is a big part of the key to unlocking better qualitative dynamics,
For sure. And the being on both sides of it, I mean, I have my own board, but I'm also on a bunch of boards. Yeah, the time waste is in advance of the meeting so often, right? Exactly what you just described. I flew, last night from Colorado to New York. I'm trying to do this on the plane with this, PDF, and I can't be helpful because I can't really digest the information. One of the game-changing things our board has talked about, and Robert, I mean, the features are amazing, right? The way that you can consume it so much more easily and create it on the front end so much more easily. I feel like it's 80% savings on both the consuming and creating sides for board members as well as the executives that are creating stuff. And you mentioned AI briefly. Didn't expect to be leveraging AI in my board deck preparation, my board Zeck preparation. Robert, these things are incredible that you've got built into the product. What's the philosophy? What's the design philosophy behind leveraging AI so effectively like you do?
I think it started from the fact, and I think my experience is likely very similar to so many people listening today as a founder who didn't have the map. We had a real board. Our first company was acquired by Walmart. Our second company that Edward and I started together was acquired by GoFundMe, and we had these amazing, really even famous board members, we had no idea what to put in front of them. And we were constantly, to Edward's point, redoing the presentation from scratch because no one ever told us, here's what you're supposed to include. So from the outset at Zeck, we really crowdsourced from these notable VCs and Vista, a framework that, just like the way Shopify created a template for e-commerce companies, we created a template for board meetings. And then beyond that, for investor updates and fundraising pitches and these additional use cases that I think would be relevant to the Techstars community. We took the next step with AI. So the workflow is that you are entering your data, and this is data you already have, clicking one button to visualize that data via AI, and then clicking another button, which basically builds your board presentation for you. And our idea is that you go from author to editor. And we save you, to your point, to Edward's point, 80% of your time while you do it. And equally important, the AI surfaces the information to your board that they care about most. So at Moose Jaw and CrowdRise, our first two companies, the shortest board deck we ever sent was 134 pages. And we did send it 48 hours before the board meeting. And we did get in the room and reread it to our board. And there was antagonism. Zeck eliminates all of that. So everything can be forward-thinking, and you actually create a collaborative experience between the leadership team and the board instead of an antagonistic one.
I also, David, I'd say something in what Robert said. You can talk about AI, but also just, penetration into the mindset of your board is great. And no one should be on a board and expect to be able to be opaque about how they feel about the organization. If that's their attitude, they shouldn't be on your board. A board member should be an open heart. A board member should be an unequivocal champion of the company. Like, anyone who is not a proactive champion of your organization shouldn't be anywhere near your boardroom. And I think the fact that they invested money, though it often is imposed as an obligation, I think CEOs should really challenge the idea that you get to sit passively and with on the board of my organization just because you wrote me a check. But I think that within that, we have existed for a long time without naming a big problem, all of us, which is to say, we've talked about the ridiculous amount of pencils down preparatory time. We've talked about the ridiculousness in 2025 of sending a fixed slide deck as a mechanism of information share and all the negative impacts of it. We've talked about the amount of stuff that could be done in a pre-meeting context. But think about the fact from a management point of view that you go to all that work, and we all went through this, just like everybody here. You send a thing across, like it's like you've sent your thesis paper in college, and you wait for the grade, and you walk into the room not knowing who read it, where they spent their time, what they thought of it. And so you sort of feel compelled awkwardly to read it back to them. But I have had this experience, and I'm sure everybody else has. When you walk into a room blind, you're already a little bit pissed off. Whether you acknowledge it to yourself or not, you resent the sensation of entering the room feeling like you've got to perform, and that you sent this thing across and that you've gotten no feedback from it whatsoever, and that you're blind. It's like you're the leader of the GD organization. You know what I mean? Why should you be blind? And so one of the things we fundamentally created in Zeck was the idea of transparency. If you're on a board and you receive the Zeck from the management team, you know that they can see if you opened it, that they can see how many minutes you spent in each section of it, that if you had questions, you could query them in private, or you could query them in front of the whole board, in a shareable way. But we resist the idea, and we're determined to end the idea that a management team ever enters a board meeting blind as to how the information was digested and received. And also, more fundamentally, whether they've got dead weight on the board, whether they've got members who have just not done their own work. Because that a management team deserves to have that analytic insight in real time as to how it was used. And I'll go one further. Another company that I started, my partner, who is our CEO. We used Zeck as a financing pitch deck early on in our things, and we were raising a big debt facility, right? And we sent it around, and we got this one response from a debt fund, credit fund, etc. And they actually gave us a whole bunch of rationales for why they were passing and everything, except we could see that they had not. We could see that they had opened the link to our entire financial presentation and everything, and not even spent a single minute inside it. So for us, it was great because the rejection had no weight whatsoever. We were like, you guys are clowns. We wouldn't ever want to work with you. You just got on the phone and lied to us about the reasons for your thing. It's so empowering for a management team to have information about how the materials they generate are digested, you know?
Yeah, and by the way, if you find that something's not useful to the board because people aren't spending much time on it, you don't have to keep creating that thing maybe, or you need to provide the information a different way. I mean, fundamentally, what you're talking about is enabling much better communication. And I think we all have seen that the boards that communicate effectively are just more effective in helping the company. It's so much of what it's about. And I teach fundraising in the context of Techstars. Our portfolio companies have raised $30 billion in venture capital. All I talk about is communication. All I talk about is how to communicate more effectively and clearly with the audience of investors that are out there. And I think that's really what you've unlocked with Zeck.
By the way, it's a super good point because obviously I do spend a lot of time in my life in narrative, right? And in language and in dialogue even, right? And sometimes people say, oh, is this like left brain, right brain doing stuff? And I always say to people, like, this is not as divergent from storytelling in its narrative dramatic sense as one would think. Companies are stories. Like you are telling a story to your customers, you're telling a story to your investors, you're telling a story to your board all the time. And when it comes to the boardroom and to your own teams, right? Like, I mean, that's why on The Office, management speak gets turned into a joke, right? Because it is a joke. It's not a human way of speaking. Nobody gets lit up and inspired by the semantics that too often we fall into. And, I'm pretty good at that stuff. Robert's really good at it. But one of the things we say in Zeck is that, there's phrases, user interface, but let's not say user interface. Let's say the flow of narrative. Like, how do we digest content now? We don't read CNN or the New York Times in PDF slides that you have to zoom in on. We read them in mobile-friendly flow, right? You want things to flow when you read them, but we also humanity doesn't really use the language of business management talk. And that's why, like, it seems cutesy on one level, but we really think CEOs need to use language like, hey, here's what's keeping me up at night. Here's what I have anxiety about. Here's what I'm stoked about. Here's what we're gonna, like, you want to use the language of inspiration. You want to use the language of emotion, of anxiety, of empathy. And the way you communicate with a board should reflect that mode of communication even. We don't want, and I think governance is a horrible word. Like, I think governance is just a word, but it actually speaks to like the relationship. That as a word, it communicates, I'm your hall monitor. I'm here to make sure you don't F up, right? I'm here to, and no management team, like, there's one VC that someone who's invested in a company that I'm involved in, I'm very, very fond of, admire a lot. And he does not sit on boards. And I said, it's so interesting. You're one of the only people I know who just, as a matter of policy, doesn't sit on the boards of the companies. What's behind that? And he said, if I don't have a level of conviction in the management team that they don't need me on their board, it's binary. I shouldn't be investing in the company. If I wanted to serve on the board, I would serve on the board for reasons other than my investment. My investment should be based on the criteria that I believe in this management team to the degree that I do not think I need to sit there and protect my investment from their errors, right? And I thought that was amazing. It's not always what a young company can do. Some Some companies can't say, hey, you don't get to invest and then sit on my board. It's difficult to flex in that way. But I absolutely think that young CEOs of startup companies should be trained differently than we've all been trained, which is they should be trained to say, okay, I will, we're happy to have you on the board, but you have a reciprocal obligation. You don't get to be passive at my company. You at the end of every meeting, you will have deliverables. You will make commitments to your forward proactive action, and you will have deliverables, or you will not sit on this board. You know what I mean? And I think that culture shift is really important.
I love it. I love it. And I've seen CEOs do that, and it's super effective. My philosophy of being on a board is I'm there for one reason, right? To support the CEO until I don't, right? That's my job. And I want to ask for, give me the homework, tell me what you need, right? And I'm going to go do that work because I'm there to support you, not the other way around. And I even notice it in your AI when Zeck is sort of taking the thing I dump in there and writing something. It will use that language that is less about, I'm checking on my investment and more about, what am I thinking about? What's keeping me up at night? Literally, it'll put that heading on things. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Maybe switching gears a little bit, you referred to the people a little bit and their mindsets. I mean, any group, any board is just a collection of individual humans. They're not this amorphous thing. You could call it the board, but it's really a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people listening, have struggled to think about, how do I build a board? What types of people are on that board? Because my investor maybe has to be there. Who are my independents? How do I think about constructing that board? I know you guys have a lot of experience with that. Any thoughts?
I can chime in really quickly. For us, we had our first board were purely financial, and they were all Stanford, Harvard people, but they had never been operators. And when we would get into the board meeting and talk about a problem and say, this is going to take us 3 months to solve, their answer was typically, 3 months? Why can't you solve this in 3 days? Well, they never really understood the domino effect of decision making, and that you really had to go 3 months out to figure out what impact is this going to have in other parts of our business and on our customers, and solve all those problems before you launch. And that was really challenging for us. My typical response when answering these questions was, because this is fucking hard. And I know that everyone on the call, all the founders here, can empathize with that. At our second company, CrowdRise, our board members were operators, and they were much more sympathetic and collaborative and supportive in our journey because they had lived it. So I think to the extent that you can get operators who have failed over and over, and you can learn from their failures, that's always been really valuable to us.
And we can even literally connect our experience at Zeck, which we're a subscription software SaaS platform, right? We're straight up in the business model of a DocuSign or a Carta or Salesforce or anything like that. Other than the three of us who started it, our board member, our only board member, James, is a multiple time SaaS entrepreneur, built and sold multiple business software companies, served as an operating partner at Vista, the great software private equity firm, and he's himself an IP attorney as well. And like, if we've had a more valuable board ally, I can't think of who it is. Like, he is essentially our fourth partner. And he does so much for us, like from contract design assistance to, he literally helps us design our contracts. He is phenomenal game, just incredible game on, I would say in our experience as people building companies, we've probably built this more to like what I'd call almost like a private equity grade system of accounting and management. And so we have so much more mature sense of this business because of having a veteran operator in the DNA with us from inception. And it's been reflected in, when Salesforce invested in our company and sent, crawled us on every level from security to legal to whatever. Basically, we got an A plus, and that was a function without any question of having a board member who was just an absolute ass kicker for us. And I think I can't overstate how important I think veteran operators are relative to what I would call pure play investors. And it's something founders and young companies have to be really wary of, which is you now have people going straight out of Harvard Business School to become VCs. You know what I mean? It is actually the first generation of venture capital investors really were they were early tech guy. They were people from HP and they were whatever. And now you have this now it's an aspiration to be a VC straight out of business school. And it's like, on the basis of what exactly? You know what I mean? On the basis of what is the insight you're bringing into me? You know what I mean? And it's just such a different experience set if you can find people who have actually run a business successfully in anything remotely adjacent to what you're trying to affect. And by the way, in my experience, those are precisely the people who want to look forward, who don't want to obsessively look backward, and who, in our experience with Zeck, are some of the board members who are most aggressively saying to their organizations, get off Diligent, get off Boardable, these repository things that actually add to the time waste, that don't, they're like, we've had some people say to us that they're going to, mandate the use of Zeck specifically because of the pre-vote functionality. They don't want to spend even one more meeting reviewing employee stock option agreements while the clock ticks, or looking at any other form of quote unquote governance while in the in-person meeting. They want, and also, by the way, when you send through financials, why should you have to read through your financials? If you don't have a board that's capable of reading the financials offline, and querying in for clarifications, then they shouldn't be on the board. And I think, again, why would you spend the time? Why would you spend everybody's precious time doing that in an in-person sense? So I think I don't even like the phrase independence. I don't even think people should say independence. It means I'm not an investor, maybe, but really what they should be saying is operators versus investors. You know what I mean? And I think, how exactly you insist on reciprocal obligation from even an investor with a mandated board seat is always a bit of an EQ puzzle. But I think one of the things we tried to create as a tool is the transparency. We talked about the transparency, a management team being able to see through to the board's activity with the material. It just means we've had some examples of people telling us that they did one meeting and that 4 out of 6 board members had done all the pre-authorizations related to the boring drudgery of governance, and a couple hadn't. And then the counsel for the company just says, okay, we've got votes from everyone but so and so and so, and Maria and Joe, and the next meeting, those people are not going to want to be the ones who didn't do the homework and wasted everyone else's time. And so there's a nice almost force function on board members being more proactive and less passive, just by having that transparency on whether they're doing their own homework.
Love it. Yeah. And I think, if we're all being honest, we've all been in that situation where you see someone who clearly hasn't done the work, and part of it is maybe it's too hard to do the work. It's not consumable. Part of it might be their dynamic and, just not doing the work, but being called out for it helps because you can now see it. It is, I think the people on the board also can change by stage, right? As a company grows, it may
Yeah.
need different people. And that's one of the dynamics too, is like, when is the right time to make a change? Different types of companies probably need different board members. And, I also think there's an interesting counterpoint. I like your operator versus investor thing. Some investors are operators, and some actually really good ones have not been. Chris
Mhm.
Sacca's, Fred Wilson's of the world really grew up, just studying companies and got really good at it and add a ton of value. But, I think you're looking for what you don't have. You're trying to identify your weakness, your need, and that's how you build your board. And it's an evolution. It's not just they're there forever, I think.
No, and it's an interesting thing. We talk about it in politics, but I'm not sure why we don't talk about term limits with board. And frankly, the law firms on behalf of companies should adopt this more too. They say, okay, with your investment in Series A, like, yeah, you get a board seat through the Series B, or for 2 years, and then it's up for review. You know what I mean? Or it's at the discretion of the company. It's like, why do we? It's not a Supreme Court seat, which also shouldn't be for life. But why do you get, because you made a $2.5 million Series A investment, why do you get a board seat for life on my company? It's crazy, right? And I think law firms are part of the problem, because they pro forma these things and they validate them, and people should be pushing back more and saying, no, I'll give it to you for, until your percentage of ownership drops below X, or until you've been on the board 2 terms or 2 years, or until whatever. Every company should have the capacity to review and make people earn that seat,
David, real fast, you mentioned Chris Sacca. I'll tell one quick story that has helped us build the framework for Zeck. So Chris was an investor in our prior company, CrowdRise, and I remember very specifically pitching him as an investor. And after the call, I said to him, "Okay, Chris, we'll go ahead and send you our deck." And he said, "Don't send me a deck. Send me bullet points that are so concise I can read them at a red light on my phone." And I said, "You have to be a badass to say something like that." And he is. But that was a great lesson for us. The idea of keeping your content concise is definitely a part of our AI.
It is, and it's super valuable. And hey, I want to maybe take some questions from people listening in. Andrea, maybe you have a few queued up, but let's do it.
Yes. All right. You guys ready? First one is for Edward. You talked at the beginning about creating these long PDFs. Every board meeting I've been to, the person that's asking the question, every board meeting I've been to is still super boring with people reading slides the entire time. Why do you think boards haven't changed that much? And why is Zeck one of the first ones to change this?
Maybe because we were suffering too long in the pit of despair with everybody else, and we just became like in Batman, like when Bane is the one who crawls out of the prison. Maybe Zeck is just like maybe we're just the ones who were able to climb the wall and get out, and now we're going to liberate everybody. But that, by the way, that should be our commercial, Robert. Our next commercial should be that Zeck is like Bane climbing out of hell.
Well, it really was built on our own. I mean, you could tell the
yes.
story of when we decided to do it was a real life. This is miserable. We have to fix this story.
Robert came. We were hanging out socially with some friends and Robert went away to join a board meeting. We were in Spain, and he went away to get on a board meeting, and he came back and said, the scene in Fight Club where you beat yourself in the face. I'm 90% sure we hung up, and the CEO of this poor company just started beating himself in the face. It was the worst board meeting I've ever been on, blah, blah, blah. And, the question is a really good one, which is like, why do people keep up bad practices? Why do they sustain? It kind of goes back to some of that stuff we were talking about in the beginning, which is, we learn by osmosis, or we learn by experience, and sometimes there are patterns of social organization that take a long time to break. You know what I mean? And I think that I do also think that there's this intrinsic problem, which is whether it's investors or donors, there's this idea that I did this for you, and so I get to monitor and protect. And that's at the root, I think, of many of these bad dynamics. But I also think that the more mystifying one to me is the idea that in 2025, with all of the other great cloud-based tools that we've seen evolve, why would we still be doing information sharing and communicating through a fixed PDF slide deck? It is beyond crazy. And I also think that, I just have to be candid. I think that the board tools that have been out there that we know all the names of are so rudimentary. They're not even communication platforms. They're just security repositories, and they charge ridiculous amounts of money. Like, it's just crazy. Like, no startup should, just as no startup today should use Excel spreadsheets and expensive hourly law firm rates to manage cap tables, no startup today should be spending money, nor should even a public company like Salesforce be paying, nearly 6 figures a year for Diligent, which is just like a security repository. It has no functionality to assist in the core communication function of the board and the board relationship. So it's like, you could say, why does anyone use IBM? Why did anyone stay with IBM when Oracle came along? Why did anyone stay with Oracle when Salesforce came along? Why does anybody, it's like we build like circulatory systems and nervous systems, and it's hard to unlearn them. You know what I mean? These things get passed down. But I do think we see reform, like I was saying, I don't just say DocuSign, but let's call it any e-signing of legal documents. Now, we finally have moved beyond the insane inefficiency of huge packets of paper being sent with yellow sticky tabs. Thank goodness we actually fixed that, right? And sometimes it just takes someone being willing to say, I'm going to put my shoulder against this problem, and something good gets fixed. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
As more people see Zeck and experience as a board member, more people will use it. And I think everyone intuitively understands that it needs to change. It's just they don't have the role model. They haven't seen how it should work. And I think more people are going to see that.
Yes, for sure. I love that. The cloud-based AI. So let's go over to AI. We actually had a few questions on this. So I think this is more for Robert. This person loves the AI additions. How does Zeck ensure its AI-driven board meeting platform mitigates bias and actively promotes diversity, inclusivity in corporate decision-making?
I think right now, the AI is really taking the data that you're putting into your presentation and turning it into executive ready content. Moving forward, Zeck will learn more about your company and what's important to you and the language of your company, and reflect that. Right now, it's more designed to surface the information that your board cares about most, but we'll get to all of that moving forward. That's not live today. What's been most important to our customers has been more on the side of visualizing the data, because they've been doing that in Excel and PowerPoint. It's a monumental pain in the ass. So our community was coming to us saying, we need a more efficient way to solve this, and a way that our board can actually iterate on the content. So that's been wildly successful, and will continue to embrace initiatives based on customer feedback to enhance the AI moving forward.
Can I tack one thing onto that? Like, I think it's the fact that all these people in the company already have this information. They have a spreadsheet that tracks whatever they're tracking because of their own operational need. They then try to adapt that to the board deck, and it's a disaster, right? what the AI does that we love is here's the 3 bullet points that are telling you what the trending is or what's changing or how to visualize it in a more simple way with almost no work. So it is mostly about that content creation right now. I agree.
Got it. So how are board members reacting to this maybe less formal, a new way of doing things? What have you guys been seeing?
Andrew, you want to take that one? Or you want me to?
You do it.
I think it's been the best part of Zeck. So the number one question we get on calls from CEOs is, will my board be able to use this? And the feedback from boards has been really incredible. In fact, 25%, maybe even 30% at this point of our user base are nonprofits. Every single one of those nonprofits came as a result of from a referral from a board member, right? So you're a board member on company X, Zeck is put in front of you because the CEO signed up. You're also a board member on nonprofit Y. You say to the executive director, hey, go adopt this. So I think the idea that the board meetings themselves are so much more efficient, strategic, and forward thinking has just been a wild transformation for board members. And that, while we don't sell to board members, we're getting in front of CEOs. The feedback from board members, I could turn on our Slack right now and then do it again in an hour, and we will have some positive feedback coming from a board member. So that's been pretty transformational. To Edward's point earlier, there is not a single board member who wakes up in the morning and is reading his or her news from in a slide deck or even from the newspaper. They're reading it on Axios, the Times. That's exactly how a Zeck reads. So we're creating, both from the content creation experience and to your question, the content consumption experience is entirely familiar with everything else they're doing today.
It's traveling from board to board. I mean, our own at Techstars, our own board members, the quote I got was, "I'm really looking forward to getting the board Zeck now," right? Like, because they know they can sit on the couch or in the plane and easily consume it and be ready to come to the meeting to talk about the thing you as the CEO actually wants to talk about. Right. And so they feel more productive. They also just enjoy the experience a lot more, and they tell other boards.
That's great. So we have a couple of founders that don't have a board yet, and they're asking questions, more educational ones. So one of them is, as a founder, how do I get the right people on the board in the first place?
David, do you want to take that one?
Sure. We get that a lot at Techstars, you might imagine.
Yeah.
Look, I think you're thinking about where are we in the trajectory of our company. If you're very early, I think the first thing that happens to people is they get scared to have a board. Their reaction is, I don't want to have a board because I don't want to have somebody that can fire me, or I don't want to have someone checking in on me. By the way, just because you have a board doesn't mean they can fire you. It might, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, especially at the early stage. And you should think of it as like a weapon, strategic opportunity, right? To have awesome people, right? Giving you input, sort of not being in the business, but thinking about it in snapshots or at a strategic level. And so you should want to have an active and helpful board, first and foremost. Second, then who's on it? What are your weaknesses, right? What would be game changing for your company? Figure out, for example, a lot of startups really need to, raise capital and don't have a proficiency at that. Having a board member that has a lot of connections in the venture industry or, to capital sources could be really, really valuable. Having an operator, right, that's built a similar type of company that's been there and done that could be really valuable. So I think it's just think about where you feel like you need help and get that help through your board, leaning, as Edward talked a lot about, towards operators that have been there and done that. I think that's often the most impactful thing.
Awesome. Last question. This one is for Edward. Ricardo says, I agree that board meetings should be functional and board members should give valuable contributions. In my experience as CEO, I had to speak truth to power to address a board that wanted my responsibility to exceed my authority in setting up a potential disaster. What are your recommendations for setting the frame for board meetings and setting the frame for relations?
These are really good questions. I would tie that even to the previous question. I want to say one thing about that previous question and get to this one. I think a lot of times companies that don't have a board yet or that are setting one have the opportunity to do something that we've discussed, which is don't allow for this lifetime seat just because someone wrote you a check. Create the limitations on that, whether it's total ownership percentage of the company or just a straight duration that no one can be on this board for more than 2 years without a review by the management team, etc. So if you still got the opportunity to set those criteria, those limiting criteria, I think it's really good. I also think it's really good to be bold, like, go ask people if there's people who you admire, who are seem out of reach, whatever, like go ask them. And sometimes, people, my partner in founding EDO, his prior company, Kensho Technologies, which got bought by S&P. It was a huge early AI deal. He never wanted a board, but he wanted allies. I was one of them. And we later started a company together, but I was just on an advisory board. And you can have an advisory board. You can, you don't have to have a governance board. You can have a strategic advisory board. You can have a strategic leadership group or whatever. And you can give people, go to people you really admire and say, I'd like to give you if you'll do this, I'll grant you some shares, and I don't need you to be on my governance board. I just want you to be, I want you to be available to me, in Mindshare. Like, be ambitious and be generous, because to get great people, because that quote unquote generosity of giving someone a little, something gestural in the company that could be meaningful if you crush it. People like that. People like to not have the burden of being a voting board member, but to be helpful and to be valued. And sometimes you can punch above your weight and get people you might not have otherwise wanted, who don't want to sit on a governance board, right? So be more dynamic and creative in your thinking about what it means to get a strategic advisor. And here's another thing. I think people bias on boards toward older people, and I think, like, people should. I think I say this to nonprofits, but I think it's true of companies too. It's like, sometimes younger people are more ambitious. They feel more complimented, and yeah, veterans are great. Like, veteran operators are great, but sometimes there are people who are entrepreneurs like you who are crushing it. And I don't know, go get peers to be on your board more. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's something people don't think about enough. I mean, to the question that came in there about, look, you're asking like the $64 million question, which is, when dynamics with boards get contentious in a mature company where you have investors who have big stakes and feel like they're, it's like, this is the nightmare, right? I mean, I think it's really, really challenging to reframe the rules of engagement when they've gotten very baked. I think everybody struggles with precisely that question. And I've sat on some boards, where I saw dynamics between extremely experienced and successful operators get very bad with their VCs. And I sympathize. I think it's challenging. Sometimes I think, something I think about a lot is the way that risk mitigation becomes its own contributor to risk, right? Like, sometimes it's almost like something you can articulate it to a board where you say, like, that you are creating more risk through your risk mitigation than actually exists. You know what I mean? And I think we've all seen that, where people, they take all elements of risk and blow it up to a 100% level. And sometimes the CEO just has to be the one who says, hey guys, risk is intrinsic. It's intrinsic. You know what I mean? You can kill a thing by risk mitigating as much as you can by taking risk.
Thank you, Edward. That was great. And thank you, Robert. And thank you, David. We are out of time. So please join us on March 13th, everybody, for the second part of this webinar series. We will be discussing the founder-investor dynamic and chatting about best practices for investor updates and building stronger relationships. And we'll hear a lot more from Zeck. So thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.